If you were to ask a century ago who the most important moral figure, they would have said Jesus Christ. If you ask that same question now, the answer is Adolf Hitler.
Hitler has come to replace the devil in people's imagination.
If only we could defeat this person, then everything will go back to normal. I think we kind of know by now that normal isn't coming back.
This is the line. We do not cross that line.
Questions that we thought were settled have been reopened. The window of what's sayable has become much wider.
There are all these divisions now over figures like Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson. People who I once respected seem to be crossing this line.
Algorithms, they've simply discovered empirically hatred and fear get the most engagement.
What is the age of Hitler?
This podcast is supported by Stewardship, helping Christians be the best stewards of the resources God gives them.
Radical generosity has always been central to the Christian story, and stewardship can help make it part of everyday life.
For decades, Stewardship has helped Christians give in ways that are simple, flexible, and deeply rooted in faith. They help you give well and see your generosity make a real difference.
A stewardship giving account gives you one place to manage all of your giving, regular and one-off, available 24/7.
You can set aside funds for future giving, respond quickly when urgent needs arise, and see clearly how your generosity is making a difference over time.
Discover more at stewardship.org.uk.
Hello, welcome back to another episode of Re-Enchanting from Seen and Unseen. I'm Justin Briley.
And I'm Belle Tyndall.
And this is the show where we aim to re-enchant an arguably secular, disenchanted, materialistic culture with, well, aspects of, questions of, hints of, perhaps a new awakening to the value of Christian faith, the way in which faith may indeed be re-enchanting our culture already. If it was ever disenchanted to begin with, then we've a wonderful guest to join us today, haven't we, Belle?
We do. Today we are joined by Professor Alec Ryrie, who is Professor of the History of Christianity at Durham University and author of many books, including his most recent, which we are going to plunge the depths of today, The Age of Hitler. So today we'll be asking Alec about the thesis at the core of this book and pondering whether history's most notorious villain is still shaping our cultural and moral imagination. So
Yeah.
the light stuff is what you dabble in, Alec.
Absolutely. We were kind of trying to work out. We always, title the show Re-Enchanting ... something. It just doesn't quite feel right to say Re-Enchanting Hitler, but we'll work out what we actually call this.
Yeah, we'll workshop it.
After we've recorded. Anyway, lovely to have you with us, Alec.
Well, lovely to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Well, just before we dig into the book itself, we always ask questions about books to anyone who joins us. And the question is, what are you currently reading?
Well, inevitably, half a dozen things. But the thing that I'm most enjoying reading right now is a sneaky advance copy of Francis Spufford's new novel, which is going to be out in the spring.
I am so jealous.
Which is called None Such, and is this amazing kind of magical alternative history set inevitably in the opening months of the Second World War. So it's got magic, it's got alternative history, and it's got Nazis. So I mean, what more could you ask for?
That is very relevant then, in that case, to the conversation we're having today. We had Francis on as one of our very first guests on Re-Enchanting, so he's got a special place in our heart.
Glad to hear it.
But yeah, wonderful stuff. Well, we want to dig into the book. There's so much to ask about, but and as ever, an hour is never going to be enough. But you do say in your intro that this book has been eating away at you, insisting on being written. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I've really got no business writing a book about the 20th and 21st centuries. Because I'm supposed to be a historian of a much earlier period. I work on the 16th, 17th. Sometimes if no one's looking, I creep into the 18th century. But having tried to do a couple of longer stories over the past 10 years or so, which have brought some of that legacy up into the modern period, I guess that gives you a certain perspective on our own times. So I mean, the one thing I can maybe claim as a non-specialist, non-research specialist in this period is that you come to it as an outsider, you maybe see some of the things that people who belong in the period might struggle to. And one of those is just how dominant this particular, I want to use the word myth carefully because I'm not saying that, I don't want to sound like I'm a Holocaust denier. This is a true myth. The power that the Second World War has had within our culture. It's more than just a set of historical facts. And when you look at it from outside that world, you start to realize, this has become all-consuming. And in the way of things, once you've spotted that pattern, you start to see it everywhere. And I had the chance to do a radio program exploring some of this stuff during 2020. So that was a fun project to work on during lockdown. When, amongst other things, I had this starstruck opportunity to interview Daniel Truitt, who, I mean, the name may not be a household name, but he's the guy who played Rolf in The Sound of Music.
Oh, there you go. We'll all be seeing him this Christmas then. Our annual dose of Rolf.
As my the producer on the radio program said, he's probably cinema's most famous fictional Nazi. And he was really interesting, just reflecting on what it has meant to play this particular figure and the impact that it's had on his life. It's been the defining part that he's played. He's now in his, well, he'll now be in his early 80s. He was in his late 70s when I spoke to him, and it still looms enormously large over him. And he talked about being rung up in the late 70s or early 80s by Dave Prowse, the actor who played Darth Vader, commiserating with him about what it's like to play the villain and say, somebody's got to do this. Which, I mean, given the way that the Star Wars movies have, I think, served to refract a lot of our modern value. That's basically a retelling of a lot of those World War II myths. I was very struck by that. Anyway, it was a load of fun doing that, doing the program, but it left me thinking there's actually a little bit more to be said here than I could do within the space of a radio documentary. And inevitably, I ended up writing a book about it. At least I've kept the book quite short.
I absolutely raced through the book. As I was saying, just before we started recording. So this book, it has a big old image. I'll just show it for anyone who's watching on YouTube. A big old image of Hitler's face right on the front, zoomed in. And actually it's quite clever because the further away you are, sort of the more clear it becomes. And so I think proof of Alec's thesis is that I have never had more people double take, stare me down as I had reading this on the tube and on the train. And there was one moment where I was reading it in my house and the doorbell rang. And so I just walked with it to the postman. And he he physically kind of recoiled a little bit, which I think is all proof of your thesis, Alec, which is that there has been an age, what you call an age of Hitler. And I think in the book you use this phrase, which is really fascinating, saying that the Nazis have an outsized role in our social imagination. And so you've touched upon it, but can you give us the thesis? What is the age of Hitler? What is this outsized role that you have identified?
Okay, so I mean, in some ways, the title of the book is a trick. It's to get people's attention in exactly the way that it has done. So for you, so I'm really pleased to hear that. Yeah. The age of Hitler, in the sense that I'm using it, is not the 1930s and 1940s. It's our own age. It's the age when the man with the toothbrush moustache has dominated our moral imagination. And the way that I have often crystallized this when I've thought about it and talked about it is that if you were to ask just an ordinary mixed audience in Britain, most of Europe, or the United States, a century ago, who the most important moral figure in their culture was, the most important human symbol of good and evil, they would have said Jesus Christ. And they'd have said that regardless of whether or not they were Christian believers or not. And you'll find the atheists, the agnostics of that era, most of them going out of their way to say, okay, we don't think that Jesus was the Son of God, but we recognize him as a great or the greatest moral teacher. I mean, it's kind of a cliche. But I think if you ask that same question, who's the greatest moral figure, in the most important moral figure in our imagination to us now, the answer is Adolf Hitler. That what we've done is swapped out a positive exemplar who shows us what good is for a negative one who shows us what evil is. And in some ways it's quite a subtle change, because your moral compass ends up pointing in almost the same direction, not exactly, but, pointing away from Hitler rather than towards Jesus. But there's all kinds of pretty serious, deep-seated implications that have, and that's what I spend a fair amount of the book exploring, where this takes us, moving from a positive to a negative exemplar, moving from a religious to a secular exemplar, moving from knowing what it is that we love and what goodness is, to knowing what it is that we hate and what we recognize as evil. So I want to be very clear in all this that I don't object to demonizing Hitler. If you are going to choose one human being to stand as your representative of absolute evil, I challenge you to come up with a better candidate. I'm just not sure that's a great way of deciding what our values should be.
It's really interesting the point you make here. A similar point I've heard Tom Holland make as well, the historian. He's sometimes, I think, almost talked about the way Hitler has come to replace the devil or Satan, in people's imagination as the exemplar of evil in that sense. And in that sense, it's a sort of secularizing kind of way of thinking about good and evil, isn't it? Putting it in on a very specific human thing rather than thinking about it in primarily spiritual terms, though maybe there is almost a sort of quasi-spiritual aspect to the kind of cult, that almost develops around Nazism, Hitler, and that kind of thing, and the way in which it's pervaded film, literature, art, and so on. One of the important points you make is how common it was for people to be writing about biographies of Jesus, literature, film, and so on, up until the Second World War. After the Second World War, we have just, I think there's a new Nuremberg film coming out this year, and we just seem to have people continue to want to tell this story. This, and Hitler in particular, seems to be front and center of people's imagination. So, yeah, I mean, anything to say on that sort of idea of Hitler kind of replacing the devil almost as much as he replaces Jesus in that kind of way?
We've clearly been trying to do that as a culture. I mean, I'm a huge fan of what Tom has done on this. In some ways, that the whole book is kind of a footnote to his argument. So yeah, I think that's been the attempt, and you can see, especially in all those fictional portrayals, this series of dark lords that we've had kind of stalking through all these mythologies. Middle Earth is the beginning of those. Or, that mythology has a complicated but really tangled relationship with Second World War. But then you get into Star Wars and Harry Potter and the Daleks and all this stuff. These are all reframings, mythologizations of the Second World War narrative, trying to make that sort of story timeless, which is what you do if you're trying to make that transition from this is just a singular historical event to this is the defining mythology that we're going to organize our culture around. But making that jump from specific historical event to timeless myth is quite tough. There are a handful of cases that we can think of where it's been done, and those are the major world religions. But I think it's becoming clear that we've not managed to pull it off in this case. We meaning our culture more widely. In the end, I think a lot of the problem I have with this way of building our values, as I say, it's not that it's wrong to identify the Nazis and Nazism as a truly exceptional evil. It's just not enough. It's not sufficient on which to build a durable moral culture. There are some very specific problems that come with trying to build our values, in particular around a war, even one that we can portray as a just war. And I think we can just see as a matter of fact, looking at the world around us, that even if it could have stuck, it's not working. So maybe there's an attempt at that metaphysic. Maybe even 10, 15 years ago, we could have said, yeah, we're gonna make it. We're gonna successfully turn this into something timeless. I think it's quite hard looking at the world in the 2020s to say, yeah, that's going to happen.
Yeah, and that's the real sort of plot twist, if I may call it that, of the book, is that you make the case that the age of Hitler is waning, and that's really interesting. And we're going to dig into the signs of that and what you think of that. But before we do, something I found so interesting, and you mention it again and again, is how it's quite comforting. The age of Hitler was quite a comforting thing. And gosh, all of these sentences are so scary to say out loud because that is not what I mean.
I've got used to talking about this kind of thing, but still occasionally I have to catch myself and say, no, that's not what I mean.
So let me clarify what I mean by that, is that you mention again and again how it's quite comforting, how uniting it is to say, this is the line, we all know it, we do not cross that line. You make this hugely interesting point where you say that at some point sort of Holocaust denial or kind of affiliated with Nazis became almost blasphemous in its in the offence it brought up in people, how that is the line. And so it's quite unifying. It's like, well, okay, I understand this. I sit within this frame. I get its parameters. You stay well away from that. And so could you just talk about that and about why we tried to do that, why it was a comforting thing, why it felt like an assuring thing, and why, therefore, its waning might feel terrifying?
I thank you. I think it's a really important question, and it's one to talk about carefully, because it can sound, I think, as you were implying just now, as if we're criticizing this. Whereas I think what we've got here is a really profound and important and really hard-won set of moral insights, which it's important for us to hang on to. When I say they're not enough, that doesn't mean that we need to get rid of them. It means we need to build on them or to reinforce them. And I think part of this is recognizing just how serious the moral crisis that the Second World War, the rise of fascism and authoritarianism, and then the war itself precipitates. One of the realizations that I had working on this is that we're used to thinking of the Second World War as this enormous military, political, humanitarian crisis, which of course it was, but it is, I think, the defining moral crisis of modern times as well. And it's a crisis out of which the traditional moral framework that Western society was still more or less holding on to, which was a Christian-defined one, even if it was in many ways a pretty secularized society, that framework comes out of the world crisis in the 30s and 40s in pretty bad shape. The performance of the Christian churches in their core duty of defining the moral priorities of their age during the 30s and 40s. I mean, it's lamentable, not only because there are a number of Christian churches which openly collaborate with Nazism and fascism, but even the ones who are opposed tend to be opposed for quite kind of limited and self-centered reasons, or just take a long time to wake up to the magnitude of what's going on. So the moral vision that comes out of the mid-40s, looking as if it's got some force behind it, isn't, Churchill's initial call, he makes in the "We Shall Fight Them on the Beaches" speech, amongst other things, for a defense of Christian civilization. I mean, that's First World War language, and it kind of already sounds out of date when he's saying it. But President Roosevelt's call for a defense of Judeo-Christian civilization, of this kind of broad coalition. And then he starts talking, well, alongside that, he's talking about fundamental freedoms, including freedom of worship, to be defended for everyone, everywhere in the world. It's got that kind of universal quality to it, which leads ultimately to the description of the wartime allies as the United Nations. And then they give that name to the organization that's founded afterwards, this sense that it's there to speak for the whole of humanity. And that leads, of course, most famously to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that's published in 1948. So that's the really compelling moral vision, the Rainbow Coalition, to speak on behalf of the whole of humanity, and to do so with a real kind of confidence and moral authority. And it sets the terms of public debate, of what's politically sayable and thinkable for, well, not just for a generation, for a lifetime, really. There's a framework beyond which it's generally accepted in the Western democracies you're not going to stray. There's a bunch of questions that we do not need to reopen because they were answered definitively in a range of policy options and ideas that very much seemed to be on the table in the 20s and the 30s that are just taken off it after the war. And you see it most obviously in centre-right politics, where amongst the Christian Democrat parties in Europe that are deliberately founded to say this is a way of doing centre-right politics which is distinct from fascism and Nazism. But you see it beyond that as well, that there's a very clear cordon sanitaire between democratic centre-right politics and anything that's redolent of fascism and Nazism. And centre-right politicians, or even centre-right politicians who are leaning into their right-wing identity, know that they are not going to cross that line. Partly because it's going to be morally repugnant to them as individuals, because they're people who are formed in this culture themselves, but also because they know that it's going to be politically toxic. That if they go down that road, they're going to alienate the vast majority of their voters. One of the examples I talk about in the book, because I think it's so striking, is the French presidential election in 2002. When France had always been one of the countries where the far right, the hard right, the quasi-fascist right had maintained a toehold in political culture. And in 2002, against a very split field, very unpopular president running for re-election, Jean-Marie Le Pen, the leader of the National Front, makes it through to the second round on 16-point-something% of the vote. And I mean, what follows is just astonishing. There's a surge in turnout for the second round, and Jacques Chirac, deeply unpopular president, widely seen as corrupt, ends up beating him on 82, 83% of the vote. The socialists campaign for him under the slogan "Vote for the crook, not the fascist." And so there is that sense of these are our shared values. There are things that we might profoundly disagree about, but this is something else. This is a place we're not willing to go. And I do not think there is a democracy anywhere in the Western world now where you could see that kind of rallying unity against a far right figure. So there's a set of taboos and certainties that were in place, and over the last 20 years they have, well, dissolved or collapsed or been broken down. But when I say that there were comforting certainties, it's that it was nice to live in a world where you could think that whatever else we would do, we would all choose to vote for the crook rather than the fascist.
Yes. Yeah.
And now things are a lot more up for grabs, aren't they?
This leads me perfectly. Okay, so the book moves through 3 parts. So you describe what you mean by the age of Hitler and how you're not actually talking about the 30s and 40s, you're talking about the decades that follow. And then part 2 is you put forward this thesis that you have just opened up for us perfectly. Thank you for that. Which is that it may be coming to an end. Or that it was somewhat of a failed, in some ways, like it couldn't hold the weight of what we put upon it.
Yes.
And so I would just be fascinated then, because this is something that's kind of hidden in plain sight, Alec, I think. So could you point towards some of the signs that gave rise to the second part of your book, this sort of step 2 of your thesis?
Okay, so there's 2 parts of that. There's the what are the signs that the wheels are actually coming off this consensus, and then there's my attempt to argue that there actually, for all that's alarming to have these questions that we thought were settled reopened, that I think there are some encouraging aspects to it as well. But as to the signs that it's happening, I mean, when I first started writing and thinking about this, it felt like it was a little bit controversial. It seems to have become almost obvious now. I mean, you see it really clearly in our political discourse. I mean, maybe that's the obvious place you'd expect to find it. That set of taboos against anything that's reminiscent of fascism on the right have clearly been breaking down. I mean, it's easy to talk about individual populist political leaders who have exploited that gap, and I think for quite a while there was a tendency for people who are closer to the older political establishments in various countries to think, if only we could defeat this person or get rid of them in some way, then everything will go back to normal. I think we kind of know by now that normal isn't coming back, and these people have sprung up like weeds in every Western democracy. They're a symptom. They're not a cause. So I mean that's the plainest sign of it. If you like, Jean-Marie Le Pen managed to unite the entire French establishment against him and barely increase his vote in 2002. His daughter has steadily increased her vote share. If she's allowed to run in the next French presidential election, there's every chance she's going to win. I think there's a comparable set of changes on the left as well. I don't want to say a parallel set, but the centrality that our memory of World War II and of the Nazi genocide has had for defining our shared values has been, if not questioned, then sort of relativized and put into a different context. And you can see that shift through the process by which, first of all, the defining feature of the Nazi regime as we remembered it has come to be its racism, such that whereas you go back a way, then that regime is defined as a vicious tyranny, which has this peculiar quirk of its murderous racial theories. Whereas I think a lot of modern scholars of Nazism would say no, the racism is absolutely central. That's what everything is built around. I mean, personally, I think actually that interpretation has gone a little bit too far. But there's clearly an awful lot in it. And the next step from that, of course, is to say that it's simply, the Nazi regime, the Nazi genocide, simply becomes one example in a series of grotesque historical crimes that are defined by racism and prejudice of associated kinds. And so it takes its place in a procession of genocidal events in which European imperialism, the slave trade are crucial anchoring points. And even you can see, I mean, I think it's really interesting the way that this language is developed. I mean, interesting, appalling in all kinds of ways. The way it's developed in the last couple of years, the way that the state of Israel has been redefined in many people's eyes from the representatives of the victims of genocide towards being a genocidal entity in its own right. I mean, if you want the short answer as to how we know that our memory of Nazism no longer defines our shared values as once it did, I mean, the sign is the kind of sickeningly obvious and predictable one, which is the resurgence of anti-Semitism on both the left and the right. I grew up in, as you say, those kind of comforting certainties of the post-World War II era. Enough so that I'm more surprised by this than really as a historian I should be. I ought to know that there's one thing that Europeans usually do in moments of stress, regardless of what the stress is about. It's to find a way of blaming the Jews.
This episode is brought to you by Stewardship, a Christian charity making generosity simple and intentional.
With a Stewardship giving account, you can support over 12,000 churches, charities and ministries, all from one place.
Discover more at stewardship.org.uk.
It is very pertinent that we're having this conversation right now, because, as you say, so much has happened actually since you started writing that book, and even since it's been published, where this seems to again be in our news feeds, on our algorithms, and so on. It looks like, for all the advances that the right has made in places like America through Trump and populist parties and so on, it's also splitting up, over these kinds of issues. And so certainly, whether or not people watching or listening see this in their algorithms, I certainly do. Among US sort of folk on the more hard right, there are all these divisions now over figures like Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson, platforming Nick Fuentes, this very anti-Semitic far right character, and yet him being given cover for by various people with significant platforms in the USA, and suddenly seeing a lot of infighting going on there between people who thought this was a line we thought we weren't allowed to cross, and yet people who I once respected seem to be crossing this line left, right, and centre. So what's your sense, without having to go into the specifics of those particular individuals, what's going on here? Why has this line suddenly seems to be crossable again in a way it wasn't, even only, 5 or 10 years ago, in my experience?
I mean, this is really important and a really hard question. Why this has happened at this point, it may just be an element of the passage of time. The war is falling off the edge of living memory. There's not many of us left to even have parents or grandparents who can tell us that they remember. so I think there was always going to be a question of how sustainable the attempt to anchor our values around a set of events which, no matter how much we've mythologized them and commemorated them, we now actually can't recall directly or indirectly ourselves. So it may just be that. There are, I think, elements to which this mythology has kind of eaten itself, and some of the inherent tensions and contradictions that are in it, some of the inadequacies that it has are starting to eat away at it. Or it may be much more contingent than that particular political opportunists have spotted something, and economic change and stagnation and all that. I don't know. I don't really have an opinion on that. What I'm interested in is what is happening and where it might be going. And my gut instinct, as somebody who was brought up with those certainties and it's all the comfort that they represented, when I see this kind of thing, is to hit the panic button and think, this means that it's the 1930s again, and the fascists are about to take over. One of the reasons I wrote the book was to try to calm myself down about this kind of thing, because actually when I look at it with my harder head on, I don't think that's what's happening. History doesn't repeat itself in that kind of a way, and the differences between our age and that are very striking. What I do think is happening, and incidents like the current spectacle of the MAGA world eating itself over these kinds of issues, what I think that shows is that questions that we thought were settled have been reopened, and that the window of what's sayable on both the left and the right has become much wider than it used to be. It seems to me we're in a moment not of kind of consistent movement towards these sorts of views. I mean, I think the striking thing about this, a lot of this moment in the on the further right in the US, is that it's coming at a moment of political weakness, and it's dividing. That party is doing the real political damage, rather than it being something expressed in confidence and leading the debate. Doesn't seem to be winning for them politically, but it shows that we're at a moment of flux and of openness, where I think it's likely over the next half a dozen years that we're going to be finding some new points of consensus, some sort of new synthesis. Maybe half. I'm foolish to try and put a time scale on it, but probably a whole lot longer. But we've got that opportunity at this point to take what has been, as I keep saying, this sort of comforting set of certainties, but that really in the end weren't adequate to doing the job that we asked them to do, and instead to rebase them on something more durable. And also, at the risk of sounding like I'm pushing my optimism into a lunatic extent, I'm actually reasonably confident that that's going to happen. I kind of think it must, although there does remain a big question of how much damage gets done along the way.
I guess reading between the lines of what you're saying there, Alec, I mean, you're speaking as a historian here, but you're also a Christian, and you've got a sort of a skin in the game, as it were, as to
so does everybody.
What that absolutely what that recalibration might look like. I mean, are you essentially saying your hope, your optimism, and perhaps some of the signs are pointing towards the idea that we might reinvestigate the moral exemplar pre-Hitler Jesus, that is coming back into view as possibly the way in which we reorient ourselves towards what is truly good, true, and beautiful?
What I think's likely to happen, what I think must kind of almost inevitably happen after we've exhausted all the other alternatives, is some sort of synthesis which draws on the really hard-won, important, painfully learned moral lessons that we took from the middle of the 20th century, but then underpins them and resources them with reference to the what in the book I call the more deeply rooted cultural traditions that we have at our disposal. And some of those traditions are secular. So, I mean, there are deep philosophical traditions in classical antiquity, in Chinese culture in particular, or a number of other resources around the world. There are some more modern traditions there, which I think would qualify on that kind of heading too. But I don't think you can escape the fact that for most people in most of the world, when you're talking about those deep-rooted cultural traditions, you're talking about their religious traditions. And because the age of Hitler, as I've understood it, it's not a global phenomenon. It's tried to think of itself as a global phenomenon because that was what the victors of the Second World War, this war between colonial powers, did. But it's not. It's primarily a North Atlantic phenomenon, phenomenon of the European and the North American worlds. And that means, of course, that the most deeply rooted cultural tradition of all is going to be Christianity. And that offers a set of resources which I think are brittle post-Nazi system of values needs. So I do think that it's not only something that I would personally value, and I have to be very careful of kind of the element of wishful thinking in this this sort of projection. Though I like to think that my inherited Scots Presbyterian gloom is enough that I'm reasonably immune to wishful thinking. I think this isn't just something that I'd value myself, but kind of the point where we're going to have to get to, because if you're on the right, you can see that movement happening already. This reach towards a reclaiming of Christianity, although that's often done as an identity rather than a system of values, a way of defining who is and who isn't. But it's been a recurrent feature of the history of Christianity that you try and claim it purely as an identity and use it as a stick with which to beat people. And you will find that stick turning in your hands. You are claiming a set of values which sooner or later some of the people following you will start to actually take seriously, and they will come right back at you. And on the left, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that the attempt just to maintain this secularized set of values by shouting ever more loudly and identifying the next group who have to be demonized for deviating from the orthodoxy of that moment. This isn't working brilliantly well as a political project. And there are a set of resources that those deeper traditions and Christianity, I think inevitably at the head of that queue, offer, which, if you're coming from that perspective, you need. I mean, most obviously, practically, things like those kind of basic moral tools like humility and repentance and forgiveness, things which our secular moral culture has really struggled with I mean, struggled with for excellent reasons. I don't mean that in any kind of disparaging way. These are difficult things, and we've become all too aware of the way that the demand for forgiveness can turn into a demand for impunity and that kind of thing. And so, in that case, you need a set of resources which know how to do this stuff, and actually to be able to handle this. So, in some ways, I think this is. I keep thinking of Churchill's comment about the United States, that the Americans can always be relied on to do the right thing once they've exhausted all the other alternatives. And I'd like to think that's still true of the United States, actually. But I think that's going to be true of our culture too. We're going to land in this position. Because I struggle to see what else is possible. We can't just pretend that the mid-20th century never happened and let go of those values, which have inscribed themselves really deeply in our culture, and for good reason. We also need to recognise, I mean, in some ways we collectively have recognised, even if we haven't fully realised it, that they're not enough. That they need to be underpinned and resourced with something else. And what else is there?
Sparking off many thoughts. I think what's interesting is there will be people, if I think about some of my friends who aren't Christians or people I know, but who are sort of like very politically engaged, and they'll actually be a bit scared about what you're saying, I think, because what they see, this idea of Christianity might be our way forward. I think they're thinking of the Unite the Kingdom march. They're thinking of Danny Kruger's speech and the Christian so-called Christian nationalism, and they're terrified of that. And so I don't think that's quite what you're talking about there. Am I right in thinking that?
Yeah, you absolutely are, and thank you for the chance to clarify that. I mean, I think the whole Christian nationalism thing is interesting as well as alarming, and as I was suggesting a few minutes ago, I suspect it may not prove completely easy for the people who are preaching it to keep under control.
Yeah.
In a good way. But no, I'm absolutely not suggesting that that's the direction in which we either need to go or will go. I think it's that as a movement is going to prove kind of hollow. It doesn't really have any substance to it. In the way of nationalisms, it's got an awful lot of nationalism and not very much Christianity in it. And insofar as that balance shifts, the more it does, then the more relaxed I become about it. But the reason why I won't say that's the way forward is not just because I think it's a pretty thin and impoverished form of Christianity that's being attempted there, but also because, I mean, you said that the folks you're thinking of would find it alarming to think that was the way forward. The reason I do want to emphasize this is not just a Christian story, but about a range of more deeply rooted traditions, is that we're not talking about a single way forward. If there's one thing that the post-Nazi values we have brings to this synthesis, to this conversation, it's that recognition of plurality. That you cannot define your nation or your political culture by a single set of values into which everybody has to be enfolded. And the points where I really see this starting to happen are not so much in these in movements such as Christian nationalism, which are driven principally by anger and exclusion, and that whole maneuver of identifying who you're against, which is basically another version of that post-Nazi politics. But the folks who are and I mean, I talk a little bit in the book about how I see this in some parts of Pentecostalism, but it's popping up elsewhere as well. And again, not only within Christianity, who are recognizing that what our post-Nazi culture needs is not a different group of people against whom to direct its hatred, but its ability to identify something that it actually values, to show it some beauty, some truth, some goodness, as well as what its villains might be.
I suppose one of my concerns, though, is that we know, don't we, psychologically, it's much easier to motivate people by fear than by, positive, good things, and that's why most political campaigns are about, if you vote for my opponent, this, that, and the other will happen. It's the motivation of fear rather than all the good things I will do, and so on. And one of my fears as well is that we've moved into this social media age, which has kind of democratized communication, but it also means it's the traditional gatekeepers, if you like, of media and morality have sort of given way to this huge number of voices, and you can go down all kinds of rabbit holes and algorithms. And I think partly that's why you are as well seeing the rise in anti-Semitism in various places. It's because of, people can suddenly go, dive down these rather toxic holes, and, you get this feedback loop through the algorithm and everything else. So conspiracy theories of all kinds, are rampant now because of that. And I just wonder, is it possible to put that genie back in the bottle? Can we get back to a kind of a shining point of shared morality when everyone is vying with all kinds of different worldviews all the time? And I don't know whether you can, everyone's, I'm sure there's a whole group of people out there who think Darth Vader and the Sith were the winners. This should have been the ones who vanquished the Jedi. It's like, I just fear that in the culture we've created for ourselves, it's hard to actually have those shared moral exemplars any longer in such a divergent set of ways in which we talk to each other now.
You may well be right. I know one of the parts of the book which, looking back on it, 18 months after writing it, I'm thinking, am I totally convinced by that? I was a little dismissive of the impact of social media on driving our ability to form vengeful pitchfork wielding mobs, which is something that people have done since time immemorial, whether or not they've had the technology to help them. I mean, it is pretty clear we're dealing with a new media landscape, which, you said it was democratizing. I guess so, but it's also driven by algorithms that are, I don't want to say they're malicious, but they've simply discovered empirically that hatred and fear are the things that get the most engagement, and so they steer us in that kind of direction. So where do I find optimism in against the prospect that we're all just going to be sat at the bottom of our wells?
I guess it's my fear is whether we can, in a way, we could all agree Hitler was terrible, and I kind of remember when I was growing up, I think because of the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein became a similar-ish figure among me and my friends. Oh, that's the kind of things Saddam Hussein would do. He became that figure. I just don't know whether we can get that common agreement going forward on either the people who are on the wrong side of history or the right side of history. My hope is, yes, Jesus Christ may become for our culture again seen as that moral exemplar, but I don't know whether we have the ability to land on an agreement in the way we once did, given our very fractured way in which we consume media generally in the world.
Okay, couple of thoughts on that. First of all, I think the extent to which we are divided is something we're capable of exaggerating. That media landscape itself likes to feed us a picture of division, partly because it can make very minority voices highly visible. And so we can become aware of a cacophony around us without realizing quite how marginal those voices are, because of the way it amplifies the outrageous. So to some extent, I think this is about us just learning to read a new media landscape and to settle into it. Although, of course, it's changing sufficiently fast that we may not have time to settle, but at least to be scrambling to catch up with it. I'm more tentative about this because it's very much based around personal experience. So it may just say something about the kind of podcasts that I end up choosing to listen to. It does seem to me that we're in a moment where there's a little bit of pushback against that echo chamber tendency, and the idea of actually having conversation with people from a somewhat different background is more possible than it was a couple of years ago. That there's a space for that kind of thing. But if your question is, are we going to find a single united shared exemplar for our values, then I think plainly the answer is no. And I think we also need to recognize that the post-Second World War period, when we had that strongly shared set of values, was quite unusual. There's a great book out there, I'm forgetting the name of the author, called "Who Was Hitler Before Hitler," and looking at the various other historical figures who were demonized. And the striking feature of all of these folk, Napoleon features strongly, and so on, is that they're all much more divisive. All of them have people who are willing to support them and support them passionately, and they don't cast themselves out of human society in the way that for most of our lifetimes anybody who, as Fuentes did, stood up and said they were on Team Hitler would. So in that sense, I think we're returning to an almost more normal world, in which, and of course, a much more interconnected, much more multicultural, in the sense that we're all living in a world where we're exposed to many cultures on a media level, if not on in terms of our personal environment, much more so than ever before. We're not going to have a single shared set of moral values and exemplars. That's why we need that set of post-Nazi values to continue to hold the frame and to allow the different value systems to play nicely together, or at least reasonably nicely. But I think there's going to be many more possibilities in the mix. And so, with my sort of Christian minister's head on rather than my historian's head, I try not to keep them too separate from each other. I would want to say, well, in this context, in this sort of emerging moment, the challenge, I think, really the moral challenge for Christian ministers of all kinds, is to find a way of speaking about their faith and their value system, which is actually going to show to a frightened, anxious, disorientated world, no, this has actually got something to offer. You say that fear is the traditional way of running politics, but Christianity has identified from the beginning that it's in the good news business. And that doesn't seem to me like a bad principle to stick to.
Yeah, that's the perfect place to land, because the key question, which you've sort of answered before everyone asked it perfectly, is to those who feel disoriented and bewildered and just scared that our values are on the move, which is such a wonderfully crafted sentence. It does feel a bit like, oh gosh, that although perhaps it's more compelling to build a moral framework upon radical evil. It's more sturdy and satisfying and true to build it upon radical goodness, right, and moral beauty, and all of these good things, and that those hard-won lessons that we learned in World War II that are still there and should still be the bedrock of things. You know, is there a sense that it's almost a relief that that can't hold us, that it's outsized, that, you know, that it's, let me be careful about how I'm phrasing this. It's kind of like the best we can hope for is not just to avoid the absolute worst that humanity can do to each other. Is there a sense where it's like we keep those values, we keep those lessons, they are hard won and they are like they're watertight, we never take them away, but we can actually strive for more than just avoiding radical evil? Does that make sense?
I would like to think so. I do think one of the reasons why that traditional value system has run into more and more political trouble over the last decade or so is that the positive offer that it's making has come to seem pretty thin, you know, pretty inadequate. You know, in many ways, regardless of whether they're on the left or the right, the old centrist parties have become the real conservatives. You know, the ones who are really kind of looking back at a late 20th century system of values and saying that's what we need to preserve. And there's not much of a sense of how we could really make things better apart from a kind of, well, we'll get rid of all the crazy people and go back to normal, which I think it's becoming more and more apparent that ain't going to work. You know, there's a lot of criticism of centrist governments of one kind or another that they don't have a narrative or a compelling story. I think it's not an inaccurate criticism, but it's not their fault. They're I think faithfully representing the wider culture that they're speaking for, which has become becalmed in this kind of way. One of the ways I talk about this in the book is to say that that culture has been very good at thinking about our moral dilemmas in kind of black and white terms, or if we're more sophisticated, we think in shades of grey, and we think that's very clever of us. But it is those deeper rooted cultures, religious but not only religious, which are able to think in full colour and say, you know, there is actually something worthwhile, something worth reaching towards in this, which is why I'm a little more confident than you were being just now, Justin, that there's something positive to be offered here rather than just finding a different way of running Project Fear. So not only do I think that's the theologically appropriate thing to do, but there's a mood of optimism that you can see in some of these kinds of movements, which, feels like water in the desert. Actually seeing a positive way forward of something that's worth embracing, something that's worth loving, rather than another tedious set of things to hate. That feels like a more distinctive offer, let's say, in the world that we're in at the moment.
I am actually an eternal optimist, rather like you, Alec, and I do, in a sense, believe that kind of when you run out of all the other options, when all the secular moralities and even the age of Hitler eventually can't feed your moral imagination anymore, you do kind of return to the original source. And I think there are signs of that. I think it's a very mixed picture, as you've already indicated, in terms of some of the tributaries of these streams in the desert. But I think, people find their way back one way or another. And I suppose that is the the bit of me that is the faith bit, you know.
We're not going to return to Christendom. We're not, you know, the Middle Ages aren't going to resume, which, I mean, frankly, I'm quite glad about.
Yeah, nor should they.
But how this plays out in the 21st century is also, I think, not going to be the kind of secularized Star Trek utopia that once felt like inevitability.
But let's hope it's not the post-apocalyptic wasteland of, you know, Mad Max either. But either way, we really value the way you've shed historical light on this. It's such an interesting frame of reference to kind of look at our current political crises and turmoils and questions of morality, looking at it through the lens of Hitler and the way in which that came to dominate the moral imagination of the 20th century, and how that's changing as we perhaps lose that frame of reference. But again, the book is The Age of Hitler. We'll link to it from today's show. Really, really worth your time and attention.
Can I say just
please go ahead.
The subtitle is also really important: The Age of Hitler and How We Will Survive It.
And how we will survive it. Yes. That's the optimistic bit. Anyway, thank you so much for being with us, Alec, on the show today. Really great to chat with you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, and thank you to our listeners or our watchers as well. It wouldn't have been the same without you. So thank you for joining us. And thank you in so many ways for making this conversation happen. If you want to make further re-enchanting conversations happen, seenandunseen.com/give is where you know you need to go. But we will see you next time.